Clover tap, we start out with a clover, which is an image. So I'm going to load the 4-leaf clover image. It is huge, so I'm going to reduce its size. So Clover Tap is a game that creates 10 clovers and then uses a timer to randomly move them around the screen while waiting for the user to tap them to make them disappear. So we'll tackle that in a few stages, but let's start just with 10 clovers. How would we get 10 clovers on screen? So you could just keep creating more and more clover display objects, but it would lead you to a difficult situation trying to keep track of them, and then also have 10 different tap listeners and tap handlers. I think it'd be kind of a nightmare. It's much easier if we organize the clovers into a table. So I'm going to create a snippet in the snippet palette all the way at the bottom, new snippet, and we're going to make 10 clovers. So to make 10, I'm going to need a table to put them in. I'm going to call it clovers. Sorry, let me zoom into this so you can see. This is the snippet object 2 that I'm editing. So I've created on line 19 there an empty table called clovers, and I want to put 10 of those into it one by one. So since I know the number of repetitions, the for loop is the kind of the obvious choice. So I'll go from 1 to 10, and I'll put my end in there. So the issue now is I need the stuff to put into the loop, which is only made difficult by the fact that the clover object 1 is in a separate script object. So I'm going to grab the clover and I'm going to copy the clover's code to the clipboard using the edit menu, and then I'm going to paste it in here. This will create 10 clover display objects. Of course, they'll all be the same image, and they'll also all be at 160 by 240, which they just stack 10 of them on top of each other. So we don't want to do that. And also, it hasn't stored them in a table so that we can work with them later. So instead of object 1, I'm going to name the table clovers. I'm going to use my index to store data in the table, and I'm going to replace that syntax everywhere we see object 1. So this loop will loop 10 times, fill a table named clovers up with 10 clover display objects. Unfortunately, they're still stacked on top of each other, so we don't want that. We want a random x and y value. So we've done this a lot of times. The syntax for the x is typically math.random 320, and for y it is math.random 480. You can obviously use a little more sophisticated random number generator here, which takes into account the display contents, width and height should you want to, but just to get us going, this is fine. This is now a snippet of code that will create 10 clovers for us. Well, actually, we should end up with 11 clovers on screen now, but let's save it and run it really quickly. There's our, if you were to count them, it should be 11. Of course, some of them could be stacked on top of each other. All right, that should be 11. One should be dead center in the screen, and the rest are randomly located around the one in the center. So the loop worked, got us our clovers. The next step would be maybe to add the tap listener. So I'm going to select object 1, and in Drawn2Code, I'm going to say, scroll down and say add listener. And the tap listener is the default. So I'm just going to click OK. That creates a tap handler and some code that's generated that adds object 1 to the event listener. So I need this line of code. Let me zoom in. I need this line of code right here. So I'm going to copy it. And then I'm going to head over to the snippet that we're working in, which is back here. And I'm going to paste this line of code into the for loop. That just says, right now it says object 1 add event listener tap to object 1 tap handler. I'm going to rename, or I'm going to overwrite object 1 with clovers J so that Now it says for all of the 10 clovers, for each one of them, create them with an image, randomly locate them. Their ID could be more useful. Since it's a table, we could say something like Clover, and then append on the number of the clover. So Clover ... J would get us Clover 1, Clover 2, and so on. So this should now set up the tap listener with the clovers. When the tap occurs, it's going to run the function object1tapHandler. Object1tapHandler is a new function that's in our stack. Okay, so I'm going to remove object1 from the code, but I'm going to leave it in case I need it later. What I've got now in our script is pretty simple. It is just a tap handler and then a loop that loops 10 times and creates 10 clovers, hooking each of them up to the tap handler. Let's save it, which should relaunch the simulator. So anytime you tap on a clover, it tells you which clover you tapped on. So the next step is, well, we want to remove any clovers that are tapped. So that's actually pretty easy. In the tap handler snippet, we've got all of this default script. But what we want to do is we want to find whatever the target of the tap is and remove it. And we also want to say that we're done handling the tap, so we're going to put the return true back in. What I want to do is I want to remove the clover that was tapped. The way I'd figure out which clover was tapped was by asking the event object. So I say event.target. That is the clover that was tapped. And I'm going to remove it using a function called removeSelf. And that's actually that simple. So let's save it and run it. We still don't have all the functionality that we want, but we're just building it up step by step to get to what we want. So this should now, whenever I tap on a clover, it should disappear. So if you're trying to follow along, you should be able to tap each of your clovers and make them vanish. So, and you might be looking at your design and thinking, wait a minute, I created 10 clovers, but the Drawn2Code design is apparently completely empty. So yeah, Drawn2Code doesn't run through your snippet code and try to interpret it. It just displays results on screen for any script objects that are in the stack. So when you have the image in the stack included, it'll show up. When you pull it out of the stack, it disappears. That's why it's empty at this point. So we're still missing one feature. We've got a table of 10 randomly located Clover images. They're each hooked up to the tap listener, and they're removed when the tap handler figures out which one was tapped. But we want them to move around randomly to make the game a little bit more interesting. So we'll do that with a timer. So I'm going to go to the Actions palette here, and about 2/3 of the way down, you'll see the button for timer. I'm going to click it. So this gives us a default timer, which is to run one time with a delay of 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds. And every time it does that, it will run this function here, object5 on timer handler. So first off, that's not really what I want. I want this to run for a bit. So let's say 30. So that'll run for, the game is 30 seconds long if we do that. And then I want to do some work in the timer handler. So here's the snippet. I don't need any of this. So I'm going to delete it this time just for clarity. What I want to do is every second, every time the timer runs, I want to re-randomize all the locations of the clovers. So to do that, I'm going to use a for loop again. I'm going to say for whatever you want to say, c equals 1 comma, and we could say 10, but again, if we change the number of clovers later, optimizing the game, I really want to say, I just want to go from 1 to how many ever clovers there are. So the syntax in Lua to do that is pound clovers. That tells us how many clovers are in the table. In this loop, I want to re-randomize the location of every one of the clovers. So to do that, we'll do the table name, clovers c.x, and I'll set it equal to a new random number. Same thing, clovers c.y equals. This is actually the exact same code we used earlier, so if you wanted to just copy and paste it, you could do that. Otherwise, this is the code that does it. The trick is, though, that as the As the user plays the game and removes clovers from the table, some of these clovers won't be there. They'll be nil. And so if we try to set the y value or the x value on a nil object, you're going to get a nil exception or a nil error. So I want to wrap this in an if statement that says if clovers c not equals nil, then, and I need another end, and then I'll indent for clarity. Okay, so this is what we want. We want to run through all the clovers in the table. If a clover still exists, that is, it's not equal to nil, we use the tilde equal sign to do Lua is not equal to evaluation. And if it's not nil, then I'm going to re-randomize its location. All right, let's save it. Okay. Wow, so they're re-randomizing, and we should be able to tap on these if we're quick enough to get stuff before it goes away.